A few years ago, I came to the conclusion that Avatar: The Last Airbender is my all-time favorite TV show. Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, the creators of the animated show, were fully committed to the story and world building of Avatar, introducing us to an incredibly compelling world with complex yet grounded and likable characters that go through beautiful and sometimes iconic arcs, using animation as a medium to allow freedom and creativity and never shying away from tackling mature subjects like war, physical and mental abuse, as well as abuse of power, corruption, death and loss, and many more, while still being appropriate for both older and younger audiences and very fun to watch. It's also extremely nostalgic for me. I noticed that I'm always ready to put on an episode. I also have Funko Pops of Suki and Appa, and my cat's named Suki, and she's named after Suki, so she doesn't like to be held. So the show means a lot to me, and when something means a lot to you, you don't want it to be ruined. So when I heard about the live action adaptation Netflix were planning on doing a few years ago, I was kind of worried based on a previous live action adaptation we've seen, and also just my general hatred for live action remakes. But then I had hope because I read that Michael and Brian, the original creators, were involved, but then they opted out because of creative differences, and all that hope was gone, and I had very little expectations for this. But I still watched it all, and I even tried to make a reaction video to the first episode, but the files got corrupted, so here we are doing a review of the whole thing. Let's start with the things I liked.
Definitely Air is least by far, because it's just...
Huh? Have you not seen what Aang does with that stuff?
Where your homies at?
It's no secret that Avatar: The Last Airbender drew a lot of inspiration from Asian culture and media. They created a distinctly Asian world with Asian and indigenous characters, to the point that a lot of people to this day believe it's an anime, which isn't the case because it's American, but most of the voice actors from the original show are white, so I'm glad that the cast of the Netflix adaptations are all Asian. And besides that, they clearly have a lot of fun together, and they clearly love the animated show, and this was clearly a dream coming true for them. And also, they definitely physically resemble the characters, and overall, pretty much age appropriate. So I'm happy for them that they get to be part of this production, and I'm excited to see them grow as actors and people with it.
Oh! Seriously? Belle, think about it.
Going into this, I was really worried that Sokka wasn't gonna translate well to live action. Mostly because his humor is, well, very cartoony. It can be easily cringy or distasteful if not delivered correctly or written correctly. And to my surprise, they did pretty well on that aspect.
What's going on? Are we dead?
Hello, Zuko here.
Out of all of the characters, I think they handled Zuko the best. He kind of feels like the only character that any depth they had in the original show carried on to this version. I also like the expansion of his relationship with Iroh. That was very sweet and heartwarming. I like M. Night Shyamalan's version, which set a very low bar for this. Netflix made the bending look really good, actually. The one thing I was worried about, they kind of nailed. And that's pretty much it, so moving on to things I didn't like. Changes aren't inherently a bad thing, especially in remakes or adaptations where they're actually welcomed. But most of the changes in this were not really justified or beneficial, so let's go through some of them in worsening order. I have no idea why they chose to do this. If you've seen Legend of Korra, you'll know this isn't a normal skill an airbender has, and there's literally no reason for Aang to be able to do this. This doesn't really affect anything, but it really irked me the wrong way off the start.
Stop bugging her, Airhead. You need to give girls space when they do their sewing.
We'll touch on it again later, but this show seems to erase any flaws any of the characters have for some reason. In the original show, Sokka is sexist at the beginning of season 1. He makes sexist comments about Katara and underestimates the Kyoshi warriors once he finds out they're just girls. In this show, they actually made it a point to not make Sokka sexist because sexism is bad and dated, and yeah, that doesn't really contradict anything from the original show. Sokka being sexist was treated as a bad thing. He's just a misguided teenager, and his flawed perspective on gender roles actually makes a lot of sense for his character at the beginning. And when he was a brat about the Kyoshi warriors, he is immediately proven wrong when Suki kicks his ass, and he learns and grows from this. And it's not like I yearn to see Sokka be sexist, but he just removes space for growth and development, which seems to be a problem for all of the characters, but we'll touch on that later.
You don't see the family resemblance? Here's a hint.
First of all, in the animated show, Azula doesn't take part at all in season 1. She appears in flashbacks in the episode The Storm, which gives backstory for Aang and Zuko, and then introduced at the end of the season as the bad guy for season 2. So just having her in this is already a change in itself, which again isn't really justified. Most of her scenes are honestly boring, and nothing would have really changed if you took her out of it. But I also didn't feel intimidated by this version of Azula. She didn't seem as confident, controlled, scary, or strong as she did in the original show. It also seemed like she was already unhinged and on the verge of a breakdown, which is a shame because her decline to insanity is probably the best part and most interesting part about her character. I guess they wanted to include her because they weren't greenlit for season 2 and 3 yet, but still, feels like she was pretty much wasted.
Water. Earth. Fire. Air.
In general, I don't think we get a lot of bending in this, but we barely get any mention of Aang needing to learn all the elements or actively learning waterbending with Katara and the importance of it. In the original show, the whole reason they go to the Northern Water Tribe is so Aang and Katara could learn waterbending, and on their way there, they also find out about Sozin's comet and the time clock that they now need to race for Aang to learn all the elements in order to defeat Ozai. In the Netflix adaptation, we get tiny mentions of it, but nothing really practical, to the point that if you didn't watch the original, you wouldn't even know how crucial it is that Aang learns the elements, even regardless of Sozin's comet.
Prince Zuko, have you forgotten what happened last time you dueled the master?
Netflix has changed a little bit the circumstances in which Zuko gets his scar. It all plays out pretty much the same, with Zuko speaking out against a general in a war meeting, which was seen as disrespectful by Ozai, who calls for an Agni Kai. Unbeknownst to Zuko, who thought he was gonna face the general he disrespected, his real opponent was Ozai himself. In the original show, when Zuko finds out he's going to fight his father, he begs for mercy and refuses to fight him, and Ozai burns him, while in the Netflix adaptation, Zuko does fight and actually almost wins, but then refuses to actually hurt his father, and then Ozai burns him. I guess this makes Zuko look stronger, but at the same time, it reduces Ozai's cruelty and also makes him look really weak, which undermines his threat level, and as the big, bad final boss of this story, I don't think this was necessary. Also, Zuko's refusal to fight his dad, which he did do a little in the Netflix adaptation, highlights who Zuko really is as a person, and how he doesn't want to hurt the people he loves, and how he isn't like his father. Also, the fact that he did step up to him now, and almost beat him, will tremendously belittle the moment he steps up to him in the future. In the original show, Aang doesn't know that the Air Nation was wiped by the Fire Nation. Even when they go to the Southern Air Temple, Sokka and Katara keep it from him until he sees Gyatso's skeleton. He is then obviously very distraught and gets into the Avatar state, and Katara needs to calm him down. In this show, however, Gran just tells him for like 2 whole minutes. And he just sits there and barely has any reaction. But then they still try to have that moment in the Southern Air Temple where he finds Gyatso's skeleton and freaks out, which honestly seems like an overreaction at this point because this is information he already knew. If anything, he should have had that reaction in the Southern Water Tribe when Gran told him. This is something that happens again throughout the show where the writers want to have the cake and eat it too. They wanted to change things, but also wanted to stick to the original, and the result is a messy, incoherent combination. There are some more changes that I didn't really like, but the biggest, most unnecessary change that not only doesn't add anything to the story but actively hurts it is that Aang doesn't run away after finding out he's the Avatar. Instead, he goes out for a breather. This change dramatically lessens Aang's character arc because it takes away from his guilt and also removes his flaws, kind of like we talked about with Sokka. But even though they changed it, there's still this insistence of sticking to the original because throughout the show, he feels very bad for abandoning his nation and the world and needs to be reassured that it wasn't his fault. But in this case, it really wasn't his fault. He didn't make a choice to run away from his responsibilities. It was just a fluke. And sure, he has survivor's guilt either way, but making it out to be a coincidence instead of a conscious choice takes away from his complexity as a character for absolutely no reason. I also feel like the execution of the whole thing wasn't done very well in comparison to the original show. In this, Aang's backstory takes about 15 minutes of screen time, when in the original it's about 5. And somehow they accomplished less storytelling. In the original, we get to see Aang getting told he's the Avatar prematurely because the war is approaching, how he was ostracized by his friends because he's the Avatar, how he found comfort in Gyatso, who made him feel that everything was gonna be okay, who eventually also gets taken away from him by the decision to take him to the Eastern Air Temple to complete his training, in the name of what's good for the world. And that is what makes him run away, which, honestly, such a heartbreaking scene makes me want to cry every time I watch it. But in just 5 minutes, they managed to establish that Aang is just a kid who doesn't really understand the magnitude of his newfound responsibility as the Avatar, and he's actually scared by it, who gets everything he ever known and loved taken away from him. His entire life is changed so quickly by something he cannot control, so even though his choice to run away is immature, we as the audience empathize with him and completely understand it. All of this character enrichment and connection to the audience is completely lost in the Netflix adaptation. There we get boring repeating exposition scenes between him and Gyatso, the council meeting where they decide to tell him he's the Avatar, and then Aang telling Appa, aka us, what he's feeling, him going to a breather, getting caught in a storm, etc. We never see him with his friends, we never really get emphasis that Gyatso is the only one he can confide in, and we never get a sense of loss or change. They honestly kind of prioritize showing violence and death over the storytelling. This series suffers a lot from telling us things instead of showing them, and repeating them multiple times. The dialogue is,
All of this is my responsibility. Yes, I need to get to the north so I could save the waterbenders.
bad, to the point it feels like it's dumbed down to us. I feel like the animated show trusted its audience a lot more than Netflix did, which is very weird given that most of the people who watch it also watch the original and are adults. They also wrote out any depth or personality any of the characters have. I've talked about Sokka and Aang, but also Katara is very dull in this. They stripped her down from being motherly, compassionate, optimistic, and fierce to just being the one who waterbends. Her arc is going from, oh, I'm not so good at this waterbending stuff, to,
You found a master, haven't you?
Yes. You're looking at her.
without showing her actually having any determination to learn it, or her jealousy when Aang can waterbend better than her, or any of her hard work to become the great bender she eventually is. Because apparently, she had it in herself the whole time. She just needed Aang to tell her that, I guess, and say some blubber, made up bullshit about energy. And going back to Aang real quick, any sense of him being a silly little kid and a literal child is gone. He's very serious, focused, no bullshit in this. He talks about wanting to play and eat banana cakes once at the beginning, but that's all we get.
Ain't got rhythm.
I don't know why 8 45-minute episodes are the norm now, but I don't think it was a suitable format for this show. Season 1 is basically book 1 from the animated series, which has 20 episodes, each about 20 minutes, but it actually uses plots from only 14 episodes, so on paper, if you do the math, it does fit. But in reality, everything feels very rushed, and nothing really builds up throughout it. Probably because everything they set up, they immediately resolve, or alternatively, they have payoffs for things they never set up. At some point, I resorted to watching it at 1.5 speed, so that's not a good indicator. Okay, this seems like I'm just hating about everything, but I do think this show lacks direction. There's one example that really bothered me when I watched it. In the beginning of episode 5, when they come across the burned down forest and Aang is angry about himself for not being there to protect it, we have a frontal shot of him where it's clearly filmed as if he's facing Sokka and Katara and talking to them, but then we have a shot of him from the back where he doesn't face them, and it's cut in a way that is not coherent at all. In terms of cinematography, this is maybe more of a personal preference, but I don't think the shallow depth of field was the right choice. If you don't know, a shallow depth of field means that one plane of the image is in focus when everything else is not. In my opinion, it robs the viewer of a fuller visual experience, makes the show look airbrushed, and loses a lot of world building because the only times we see the world is in wide establishing shots and not with the characters in it. This is Halloween, this is Halloween. I don't really understand where all the budget went because the costumes and makeup in this didn't look good. Wigs are very noticeable, both because they didn't blend them well to look like actual hairlines, but also because their material looked shaped and plasticky. What they're wearing also looks cheap, like something you'd find at Halloween stores. It doesn't look authentic and it doesn't look worn. Also in terms of makeup, Zuko's scar wasn't prominent enough in my opinion. It's supposed to be the first thing you notice about him, but I fear that if you squint or watch it without your glasses, in some scenes you can barely see it. It's also way less severe than what it was in the original show, where Zuko doesn't have an eyebrow, his eye can fully open due to nerve damage, and the scar goes up to his ear. It's just a huge part of his character's motif and arc, so it's a shame that they minimized the look of it. It seems like all the CGI focus went into the bending, because every shot of them on a green screen or in front of the LED volume stage looks really bad. What was I made for? I believe believe that one of the most important parts of creating films or art in general is having passion for what you're creating and how you're creating it. Unfortunately, this feels like a cash grab. There was no reason for making this other than making money by attracting an already existing audience to watch the show. And sure, you can say that every movie or TV show's purpose is to get money because at the end of the day, production studios greenlit projects that they think will make them money. That's just how the industry works. But at least then the creators are creating something new. Even sequels or movies that are based on already existing materials expand the world or give a new perspective on it. Well, in this case, I feel like they didn't achieve anything new, and there was no benefit from a viewer perspective from making Avatar: The Last Airbender live action. It might have been a good idea at the beginning, but it turned into purely monetization purposes. And I feel like a big indication for this is the decision of the original creators to leave this project. Michael writes in an open letter, "I realized I couldn't control the creative direction of the series, so I chose to leave the project. Netflix live action adaptation of Avatar has the potential to be good. It will not be what Brian and I have envisioned or intended to make." Brian writes in his own open letter, "When Netflix brought me on board to run the series alongside Mike, they made a very public promise to support our vision. Unfortunately, there was no follow-through on that promise. The general handling of the project created what I felt was a negative and unsupportive environment." So, in conclusion, would I recommend this? No. Just watch the original series. Will I be watching season 2 and 3? I actually don't know. When the time comes, we'll see. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Bye! I'm gonna have a nightmare editing this. I already know this.